This podcast is brought to you by American Civil War and UK history. This is for the Passion of History podcast. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel or as a podcast from wherever you get your podcasts from. If you're watching on YouTube, please remember to hit the subscribe button. And for blog posts, updates and links to all of our content, including all of our social media pages, please head over to our website. Link can be found in the podcast's description. Cheers.
Hello, I'm Daz, and this is the first episode of For the Passion of History podcast. So a little bit of background on why I've decided to launch this podcast. So the podcast will be available through American Civil War and UK History's channels. So YouTube will have a playlist dedicated to the podcast. It will be available from the same place you get your podcast from, but just called For the Passion of History. The reason I'm launching this offshoot is sometimes I would like to discuss other periods of history which are outside of the American Civil War and UK history area. So this platform will allow me to do that. I'm not going to create new social media pages or anything like that. So everything will be on American Civil War and UK history's web pages, Facebook, Instagram, all that. There will also be two sections dedicated to it on the website. So there'll be blog posts for the Passion of History, as well as a podcast. So you'll be able to find everything on there. Now, today's discussion is going to be about other time periods of history. So we thought it'd be fun to start it off. And I've got two guests waiting in the wings that are going to come on in a minute. And we're going to discuss other things that we like in history, apart from the American Civil War and UK history. So waiting in the wings, we have none other than historian and a good friend of mine, Tim Willging. Please come into the room, Tim.
Hey, Daz, how are you?
Welcome. Thank you, mate. And we also have Dr. Nathan Provost. So please, Nathan, please enter the room. Thank you very much. Welcome, Nate.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Okay, so yeah, this is a new thing that we're branching out to do. And again, I've got two great guys with me to do that. And I know you boys love your history too. So, but we're going to start with you, Dr. Nathan Provost, because your title has changed, hasn't it? And so do you want to explain why and what went on there? And this warning, ladies and gentlemen, it's the only time we're going to mention American Civil War and UK history again.
Right. So I actually just defended my dissertation this past month. I believe it was on October 26th, around there. But yeah, so I finished up my dissertation on the Battle of Cold Harbor during the American Civil War, essentially arguing that it was a operational and strategic Union victory that took place. I think we could go back and forth about the tactical side of it, depending on how you measure victory. But ultimately, operations and strategy are probably the two most important aspects of warfare. But yeah, no, it was a great experience. I got to have an awesome conversation with three professors, and I think it went very, very well. And they decided, I guess, at the end of that to give me the title of doctor, which it was great. It was wonderful.
Awesome. I'm really pleased for you. Congratulations. Yeah, so you were just saying you had to sit there in front of professors and so how does this actually work? Because I don't understand how it works, obviously, because I would, never been in that situation. So what goes into that? So it must be quite scary going in there and seeing these people sitting there staring at you.
It actually was, to a certain extent, because I didn't know how to prepare for it, and I hadn't talked to anyone that had done it before. So, there's kind of this part where I had to make somewhat of a presentation about my overall dissertation, and I had to do that presentation in 15 to 25 minute time crunch, which was very hard to do based upon how much I wrote. So I really had to squeeze everything in a very shortened amount of time. But then it was nice. Basically, after I finished that presentation, the professors, it was like 2 rounds of questioning from the professors, and each one would ask me something like, I don't know, 4 or 5 questions. But really, I mean, the whole thing took about an hour to complete. And then towards the end of it, that's when the professors, they actually broke into like their own room and they conferred to make sure like, I met the standards and expectations of what they want me to achieve through this dissertation. And they came back on and essentially gave me, they explained, just add in these 3 paragraphs here to your dissertation, call it good, congratulations, Dr. Provost. And it was awesome. It was
Excellent. A lot of hard work went into that, didn't it? So you must be. And again, you probably
two years of writing.
yeah, you probably want to rest from Grant and the Civil War for a little while. So, okay, then let's go to you, Tim. So, what other periods of history? And you're not allowed to talk about the American Revolution because I know you're a big fan of that because that involves the UK and Britain and all that. So, apart from the American Civil War and UK history, what are your other areas? And then maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion about what you talk about and say. And get big long list down there. Yeah.
If I'm going to be constrained from talking about the revolution, I mean, I don't actually know of much of anything else that I read on a regular basis that doesn't involve the UK.
Oh, okay.
World War One involves the UK. World War Two involves the UK.
Well, no, you can talk about America's involvement in World War Two.
Okay.
So you obviously like that, don't you?
I mean, this is a change over the last since I finished my master's, which did involve that conflict we're not talking about. My other interests have kind of taken over my bookshelf, so there's still some Civil War retained on those 2 shelves, but the rest of my bookshelf is all World War II.
Yeah. So is that more specific stuff, or is that?
It's a mix.
Is it a mix? Yeah.
I've got a 3-volume series on the UK's most famous general from World War II that I'm slogging through, trying to change my perspective. But much of the rest is America. A lot of it's Normandy, just because of the sheer amount that was written about it. I've got a bunch of new titles on the bulge. I've just picked up a hard copy of John McManus's New Island Infernos. It's his final book. It's volume 2 on the his Pacific War series. So really interested in that. Just the dynamic, the difference in how the different theaters of American involvement in World War II were fought. In a lot of ways, you could make an argument that the Pacific theater was a lot more brutal.
Oh, definitely.
A lot of people chalk that up to racial differences, and I think there probably is a lot to that. But just that it was a lot more of a brutal conflict. And then the other title I had there with it is also about the war in the South Pacific, basically everything outside of Nimitz's area in the Central Pacific and then outside of MacArthur. So, which basically boils down to really just Guadalcanal, and goes into a lot of the, it's focused on the ground combat. So on the islands, so much of it's Marines on Guadalcanal, and then there were actually a couple Army divisions there. One of the little known facts about, which you follow my Facebook page, it shows I put it up every now and again. There were actually more Army divisions involved in the Pacific in World War II than there were Marines by a considerable number. And actually, if you look at it, the Army in the Pacific by itself would have ranked in the top 10 armies by size during that period. So it's a pretty interesting topic. But outside of those conflicts, I read a lot of World War I stuff, staying away from the UK's I like reading about Gallipoli, but specifically the involvement of the Anzacs.
Yeah, so one thing I'm getting is that it's very hard to find anything what the UK was involved in.
There's that.
I know they were involved in World War Two, and I get what you're saying, but yeah, like the revolution, like we're directly sort of involved, whereas we're fighting each other. Whereas World War Two, we sort of, I know we were sort of allies, but yeah, I suppose in
Yeah,
Europe, I suppose it's difficult actually, isn't it?
yeah,
Didn't realise,
and then
yeah,
and then I guess as far as like little interests that I keep, that turns out to be a lot more than a little interest when you look into it. I read a lot of Napoleon on the side. Like I can't, whenever a Kindle sale comes up, they tend to do these great markdowns on like pen and sword books, which is a great
yes.
publisher. I can't not get a $3 book on the Napoleonic Wars when it shows up. So I was actually cataloging, and turns out over the last like 5-6 years, with this guilty pleasure of mine, I've procured like 60 titles on Napoleon stuff. And a good friend of mine, my former librarian from high school, actually has written a good number of those. So I'm kind of slogging through his books about about a couple British units during the Peninsular Wars, and then or Peninsular War, and then Waterloo. So,
So I know you obviously mentioned the Pacific there, but have you got any like favourite movies or TV shows from like that portray that period of history? Because I really liked the actual TV show Pacific, but I had to watch it twice before I appreciated that. But I know there's quite a lot out there, isn't there?
It's taken me a lot longer. You know, when it comes to like the Pacific Theater, I wouldn't none of the depictions really struck me very favorably the first time I watched it.
No.
The Thin Red Line, it's about a army unit on Guadalcanal. That took me years to appreciate, but
Yeah,
I do
I haven't
now.
really appreciated that myself. Actually, I find I need to rewatch it. I think, yeah.
And then I guess I did enjoy The Great Raid, about the Rangers' capture of the prison camp at Cabanatuan. So that one I always enjoyed. But generally speaking, the Pacific really, you had like John Wayne's, what is it, Sansi Iwo Jima, and then you had Clint Eastwood's two movies, Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima. But there really wasn't much done on the Pacific, at least the ground element. It just really doesn't translate very well to film.
We're,
I think a
we're
lot
not
of
going
that
to
had to
mention
do
the
with
Pearl Harbor movie because that was really shite.
it was.
The action scenes were great, but the rest of it was a load of crap.
I saw a great meme. It was basically, there were a couple historical accuracies in Pearl Harbor. There was a place called base at Pearl Harbor, and it was attacked.
Now,
and that's about it.
What about? I mean, I used to play a video game called Medal of Honor: Rising Sun. Do you remember that, Tim? You probably remember that because you're that same age as me. Sorry,
I
mate. You just sit there a minute.
I played that.
Oh,
I
did you
actually
play
do
that?
have very fond memories of that game. Me and my father would actually
Wow,
play that
awesome.
game together.
The reason I brought it up because it starts off like Pearl Harbor, like in Pearl Harbor, doesn't it? And you're laying in your bunk, and there's like this Hawaiian music playing, and then you have to get up on the gun deck and start shooting all the Japanese planes.
Yeah.
Do you remember that? That was fantastic. What a great game, a series of games they were. I mean, I had some of the early ones. I had Medal of Honor 2, which was set in Europe. And that was
that Allied Assault?
I think so, something like that. But then it's all
that was
changed.
a good game.
Some of them were really good, but it's all promoting history at the end of the day. So we'll get on to you in a minute, Nate, because I know you've got like a relative that fought in some of the wars, in World War Two and Korea. But Tim, have you got any family that fought in some of the early wars, like the World War Two, sort of World War One, or anything like that?
So I had no grandfathers in World War II, or great grandfathers for that matter. One of my grandfathers was 4F, so he was ineligible medically. He kind of took that pretty hard. I think also he probably they probably took, well, from my understanding, they may took his, family size into consideration, since he had multiple kids under 5 at that point. But he, was met at 4F based on his on a foot problem and then his eyesight. My other grandfather was a Korea era veteran. He was basically a secretary to Air Force commanders, to generals. He was an admin guy. So he was in the Air Force during Korea, but never went over there. Both my dad and my uncle are technically Cold War vets. And I mean, my dad was a JAG in the Air Force, and my uncle did engineering on carriers. Going back to World War One, one of my great grandfathers was in a unit that he was enlisted at the end of 1917, but for some reason his unit didn't get mobilized or federalized until October of 1918. Because they joined state units, much as they had since before the Civil War, and then the units would eventually get federalized and sent overseas. His was not. So by the time they were about to be federalized, the war ended. So he was basically discharged. But he's listed as a veteran in North Dakota, but didn't really see anything. But I had one uncle, or I had 3 or 4 uncles who were sent over during World War One. And one of my mom's uncles was in World War II. Well, she had several on both sides of the family, actually, that were in World War II. One was in the Pacific, actually, was in the 25th Infantry Division. He won the Bronze Star in the Philippines, in the 35th Infantry Regiment, at a place called Baliti Pass, north on the island of Luzon. So I'm pretty proud of that. And then probably the coolest family story I posted on my Facebook page before was probably our most famous veteran in the family. He was a fighter pilot. He's a first cousin. He flew F-4Fs off of several carriers, the Enterprise, Lexington. He was actually shot down. I forget the name of the island chain, but the sub that rescued him had just the day before rescued another pilot, and they ended up rescuing a few more, and then they all signed a piece of my cousin's lifeboat or life raft that he'd used after he'd been shot down, because the sub couldn't get close to him because it was too close to shore. So basically it pulled him out by its periscope until they were a safe distance away. So he pulled his lifeboat ashore, and then they cut off a piece, and they all signed their name and put their thumbprints on it.
What an awesome story.
And
awesome.
And the pilot that had been rescued right before him was Lieutenant Junior Grade George Herbert Walker Bush. So the famous photo of Bush getting rescued after he was shot down, 24 hours later, they were doing the exact same thing with my cousin. And unfortunately, it isn't all a happy story, because he was, cleared back for duty and was shot down and killed at the end of 1944 over the Philippines, what was Clark Field. So nevertheless, it's, point of pride for the family. They served honorably. But yeah, I've calculated a bunch. I'm big into genealogy, so I've calculated, 50, 60 cousins, uncles that served in World War II, and roughly the same number for World War One.
Wow, awesome. Okay, Nate, I'll bring you into the conversation, mate. And so what other parts of history do you like? Are you into? Well, I know you're into the Napoleon, aren't you? Reader.
Yeah.
What else?
So I've actually, I like reading about a lot of different things. I'm currently reading a 3-volume biography on Andrew Jackson right now, which is very, very good.
Awesome, yeah.
I'm also currently reading The Campaigns of Napoleon by David Chandler. That's excellent. It's a very, very good book.
But Andrew Jackson is, I know you said Prime Minister then, President during the War of 1812, is that right?
He was not at that time. He actually
Oh no,
served.
he's the one that's at New Orleans. That's right, isn't it?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That's what he's. That's probably what he's actually best known for outside of being a president.
Mm-hmm.
But he also is responsible for um, basically, if you want to call it conquering Florida. I mean, that's basically what happened. He fought in the Creek War. He's largely responsible for uh, fighting a lot of the tribes down in the southeast, and he was a guy that had a horrible temper. The one thing I'm learning about him, I didn't realize how many duels that guy was in.
Oh
He was in a
dear.
lot of
Yeah.
duels. He killed people. I didn't realize he killed people. Um,
So
but
it didn't take long for someone to upset him then, basically.
no, well, and
Fascinating character.
you, it's kind of hard to exactly pinpoint why, his temper, and I don't want to get into the whole, psychological history or anything like that. But I mean, just based upon contextually speaking, he had a very rough childhood. I know that his family does end up passing away when he's very young. He's very poor at one point in his life, and he's very much someone that's like, I got to pull myself up by my own bootstraps. Um, and he just didn't have too much patience for people. And they didn't have much patience for him though. He sometimes rubbed people the wrong way, and he created a lot of enemies doing that. So, but it's a very good book, or very good series of books. It's excellent. Um, I'm still on the first volume, but Andrew Jackson, very interesting character. Campaigns of Napoleon. I really enjoy reading about the Napoleonic Wars simply just based upon there's so much fighting, there's so much political history, social history, military history. There's just so much going on that you get every aspect of history that you might enjoy, just based upon this one big event. It's very transformative in that instance. Um, and I really do, just strictly speaking, enjoy military history, and that's
Yeah.
something
Okay.
I I very much
So you don't
enjoy.
tend to sort of step out of that sort of military history sort of stuff, really. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
That's all right. That's not a problem. I mean, I'm probably sort of quite like that as well myself, really. But I quite like social history, of how things have changed for people and, you know, over the years and how people live now and
Well, and
or
their
dead,
in their personal experiences, and just simply how you know they they experience certain events, and you even within my dissertation. Sorry, I'm going back to this,
That's
but
all right. You carry on. Yeah.
um, one of the most interesting things about my dissertation simply was just reading about um, there were Union soldiers that belonged to the Ojibwa tribe, and they were sharpshooters. But they fought for the Union, and they were very well known among the New York regiments, and they played a very important role at Cold Harbor when it came to sharpshooting other Confederate soldiers that were there. Um, but I mean, those are just some of the aspects that I think are really important. And in fact, I actually I'm also reading a biography on John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, and yes, that's British history. But
Yeah.
the guy that actually wrote one of the most famous biographies was one of his ancestors later on, Winston Churchill.
Yes.
And Winston Churchill actually has an awesome quote in this, and it is a wonderful quote. And this has to do with just simply the significance of reading about military history and just kind of like the general interest of it. But he says that great battles, won or lost, change the entire course of events, create new standards of values, new moods, new atmospheres in armies and in nations to which all must conform. And I think that simply goes back to, even though military history might not be studied all that much now within university, um, the reality is that the consequences of military history are quite profound in their impact on just about every single culture and country and nation state, whatever. But and that's why I always really do push and advocate for military history, just because I feel like it's somewhat on a low point in terms of popularity with people. But I enjoy reading all of it. I just really, really enjoy military history specifically.
Hmm. And so, what about some of America's earlier wars, like the Mexican-American War? Is that something you've delved into yet, or not really looked at? Because it's something that I'm thinking of looking into myself. Really, obviously, through launching this, probably going to do a few episodes on that.
Well, and
It
it's
involves a lot of famous Civil War generals, doesn't it?
yeah, I'm pretty sure there's a book out there that's I think it's called The Training Ground, and it specifically talks about the Civil War generals that had fought in the Mexican American War. And yeah, I am very interested in it, just in terms of
Because really, this is like you said, this is where they learn their trade. People like Grant and other Sherman and all these guys. They all learn their trade, don't they, through going into on this campaign into Mexico, sort of thing.
well, they learn about each other. I mean,
Yeah.
they figure out you know each of their personalities and who they were. Um, I mean, Grant certainly remembered who Polk was.
Hmm.
He
Well,
did
he
recall
remembers Robert Lee, doesn't he? But
he
obviously, Lee doesn't
remembers
remember
Robert
him.
Lee.
Yeah.
So but outside of even the Civil War, there, I mean, you still have characters like Winfield Scott. You have Zachary Taylor, both of who are extremely important within American history, and largely somewhat forgotten. I mean, Winfield Scott, and Tim, you can correct me here if I'm
Yeah,
wrong,
Tim, jump in on the
but
conversation on this because I'd
but
like to know whether you're interested
if
in that period as well.
if
Will do.
the Winfield Scott, I believe, still has the longest serving record within the American military. I could be wrong on that, but
Yeah, so when he comes into service at the beginning of the Civil War, he's in the
oh,
pod
he's
as really,
already
really well liked, really respected guy, isn't he? And
he's
that's
I
why
very
mean,
they
well.
rely on him.
But
he had the longest record of service as a general
okay,
because he makes general in I think 1813
okay,
during the War of 1812. So by the time he gets off active duty, he's been a general because he leaves active duty at the tail end of 61. So he'd been a general for 48 years.
So he really knew
Um,
his stuff.
I mean,
well,
he is underappreciated. It is my understanding he was considered for one of the renamings of the posts here in the U.S. that they might look at Winfield Scott because he was a Virginian who stayed loyal to the Union during the Civil War. But to be honest, his career was too extensive to really allow for that because in the midst of his career, he had the Black Hawk Wars, played a role in the Army's efforts during what became known as the Trail of Tears, relocating the Cherokee, and they thought that reflected badly on him, as if he planned it, which he didn't. But that's neither here nor there. So they, never really put him forward as a viable option. So, but his career was supremely profound, and he was a big, there's books about his involvement, blurring the lines between the civilian leadership of the military, and he was being touted as a potential presidential candidate, and that made the President Polk nervous during the Mexican War. So
Well, ironically enough, Zachary Taylor came to be the bigger threat. But Winfield Scott, what's actually somewhat interesting is what he actually became well known for, at least worldwide and in military circles, was the invasion into the heart of Mexico. They're invading Veracruz and then marching inland. That's what he probably became best known for. And even I think even the Duke of Wellington,
Yeah, he admired him.
Oh, definitely.
he admired Winfield Scott and actually praised his campaign in Mexico.
Yeah. Wow. I think there's definitely an episode about him in the work in the back there somewhere.
I mean,
Yeah.
and
Wow.
many commanders, many future Civil War leaders, Grant, for example, served under both of them during the war, and it's interesting seeing their differing opinions. I mean, to sum it up, Grant liked both. But they both had their, flaws and advantages. So,
And we can get into more of that later, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah, that's a
Yeah.
really interesting period that I think gets overlooked quite a lot and will have a profound effect on the Civil War when it kicks off. And here we are mentioning the Civil War again, so I do apologise, everyone. But Nate, anyway, let's go back to your grandfather. He served during World War II, didn't he? And the Korean War. So just if you wouldn't mind, don't have to go. You go as deep as you want, but talk about your grandfather, because I know he's special to you, because you mentioned it in I think in your introduction for Happy Saturday or something like that, didn't you? So just like to ask you a little bit about that and just talk about that if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. So my grandfather, his name was Richard Provost, and he has a really kind of interesting life, and he's someone that I always looked up to and admired when I was a kid. He talked a lot. He definitely talked a lot, but I learned a lot from the guy. He was born in 1927 in Massachusetts. He was extremely, extremely poor. His father was like a shoemaker. He made shoes, and they didn't make much money. And he had something like, I don't know, 10 sisters or something like that. He did have a very older brother,
Take
uh,
it.
but, but he was the
Outnumbered.
youngest of the family, and he was born 1927. So, you know, he he actually is going to go through school. His parents require that he pays them rent when he's, I think, only 11 years old.
Oh,
So what he actually does for his first work is in, the city he lived in, which, uh, they didn't have elevators, and it was just like those staircases off to the side of the buildings and whatnot. When he actually worked for a grocer, and he actually would take the groceries and run them up the stairs. That's what he got paid to do. Um, and that's how he's able to pay his parents. And then finally, when World War II broke out, he actually tried leaving home at 16 to go join the Canadian Air Force, because his grandfather immigrated from Quebec to the United States sometime in the 1880s. And my grandfather explained to me that they actually came over because of their interest in the United States, and my great grandfather would go watch um, Wild Bill Hickok and all them, and whatever, they go to those shows, or maybe it was Buffalo Bill Cody. That's who it was.
yeah.
They go see Buffalo Bill Cody.
I'm gonna delve into some of that in a minute, but yeah, carry on.
Yeah. But regardless of that, my grandfather, he just had kind of this weird, interesting life growing up. He told me that he actually got to talk to and meet, Union veterans, because there were still Union soldiers
Yeah,
alive at
that's
this
right.
time.
Yeah.
And they still had parades. So he would see the Union soldiers in the parade and everything else,
Wow.
which
Good
was
fun
really,
time.
yeah. And, so anyway, he tries leaving home at 16 to go join the Canadian Air Force, but my great grandmother, told him no, he can't go, and she begged and pleaded, and they wouldn't sign off on his papers either. So, that was out the door. So he ends up just joining up in 1945 with the draft, and he actually joins the Navy. He doesn't join the Air Force or Army. He ends up joining the Navy, and he's actually sent out to California. And he actually doesn't see much service in World War II. He is responsible for. He becomes a physician's aide, and he ends up working with guys that are wounded, and he also guards German prisoners that are actually in California at this point in time. So he actually, I don't have it around here, but he actually got a gift from a German soldier that made a little ship in the bottle while he was guarding him, and the German soldier gave it to him. And then once World War II was over, he went back and got an education for a brief period, and that's when he met my grandmother. But around that same time, he actually gets called back up into the service for the Korean War. And that's actually when he is stationed on a ship. He goes out, and that's when he's working really closely with some of the Marines that were in Korea, and he was always very, very proud of that. I don't know too much about his time in Korea, and I know that he worked with guys that actually were very seriously wounded there, but otherwise, for the most part, that was his primary service. Was
most veterans don't want to talk about their experiences because they probably experienced some really harsh and horrible stuff, didn't they? So, so did he never ever really talk about any of that to anyone, or
not the stuff, not that stuff. No. I mean, he would tell me some of the jokes they'd play on each other and whatnot. Like the on board the ship, their toilet was kind of a stream that went down.
Oh, no.
And so guys would sometimes have to squat over it. And some of the guys, he said, they would get a little piece of paper and they'd light it and they'd set it in the water. And as it was going down, it would actually brush over some of the butts of the guys that were squatting over it. I
reckon they've been doing that for thousands of years.
Yeah, so
well, not with toilet paper, but yeah.
Yeah, so he liked always telling that story.
That's really cool.
But when he came back, though, he actually decided to get his degree in psychology, and I'm actually not the first Dr. Provost. He is.
Oh, nice.
He went on to Texas A&M, and he got his doctorate in psychology. And he ended up working at Texas A&M, and then he worked at the University of Nebraska at Kearney, and then he ended up in Iowa. So he was the guy that, for him, it was really important that I get my education and that, my sister get her education. And that was just so important for him. He'd bring me history books all the time. And just, he'd always bring me a new set because he loved history, even though he was a psychology guy. That's just what he really enjoyed. And I just fell in love with it. So, I just have very good
trips to some of these historical battlefields, or
it's funny. He never took me to any historical battlefield or anything. That was something I would do on my own later on. But he just kind of got that interest. He brought me those books, and that kind of opened up this interest in history for me. But he had talked about, because my uncle also served, and he was stationed in Germany during the Cold War. And so, my father and my grandfather and my grandmother, they went to Germany and France, and they visited him, I think sometime in the 1980s or something like that. It actually might have been a little before that. It might have been 1978. I think that sounds right. That's when they went over. And Darren, you should know, this should probably make you feel pretty good. This is when the French didn't have toilet paper yet, and they had to use
they use their socks
like that, and supposedly they had to use paper bags or something.
Good.
So that's at least what my father.
I'm only joking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic, Tim. Do you know what? I don't think I probably have asked you, and you probably have told me, but because what Nate just said there of how he sort of his grandfather father like got him into history really, but I don't think you've ever told me how you sort of got into history. Did you have any like, you know, someone like that sort of, you know, got you into history in a way, you know, or made you become
Nope.
interested in it? No, you just sort of, you're like me, you just sort of got interested yourself.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
my interest in history really got started because they aerated the Gettysburg battlefield, and a 5-year-old version of myself believed they were bullet holes, and my parents allowed me to believe that was true.
There you go.
Before they knew it, I was obsessed, and there was nothing they could do about it. So,
Oh well, never mind. And then
There's
you met
worse
me.
things. There's worse things.
Yeah.
so
So a lot of people might not know, you know, this is UK history, but obviously the reason I really get into history is, firstly, I'm tripping over the damn stuff, which is not a bad thing. But is the gunpowder plot was my first sort of real sort of thing into history, and then also we have a place called the Smugglers Caves in Hastings, which I remember going as a kid. And well, these caves are really old, you know. I mean, there's a carving in there that predates a lot of stuff. But during that real, you know, that period of piracy, these caves were used, you know. And there's a really spooky place. But my mum took me there, you know, and places like that. So. But the gunpowder plot is really the reason why I got into history. Hence the reason why I did a blog post the other week, because I wanted people to know the real history behind it. But other histories, a lot of mine's American history, to be honest. And I was talking to Nate before he came on. So I really like the Prohibition period and like the early formation of the mobsters. But I really, obviously, this carry on for the Civil War. I love the Wild West period, and go back to TV programs. Deadwood, oh, what a TV show! What I had to wait a long time for them to finish that. Going back to Wild Bill Hickok, he's featured in that. You've got that other lady, Calamity Jane, I think it is. That is such a great. I mean, if you can put up with a lot of swearing, of course, you know, because there's an awful lot in that. But that TV show was so good. And Ian McShane, oh yeah, he played a real good character in that.
The downside to Deadwood is it makes you want to go there, and then you go there, and I hope I don't offend anyone, but there's nothing left from. I mean, the figures are there, you know. You go into the cemetery called Mount Moriah, and you have Seth Bullock and Wild Bill and Calamity Jane are buried there. So in that sense, it's true, but there's nothing original. You know, they have a saloon number 10 sign, but it's on the opposite side of the street from where it was. You know, the saloon where Wild Bill died. So in so many of the, you know, Old West towns that are really famous have been lost in that way, largely because, you know, fire was a thing, and, you know, they all burned down.
Yeah,
you know,
everything's made of wood. Yeah,
Dodge and Deadwood, and I've been to most of them. And
didn't you
generally
put
speaking,
something up about the OK Corral the other week? I'm sure you did. Was that you that put that up? Yeah, so that's another interesting. Don't get me started on that movie. I think it's awful. They've got white teeth, and it's just wrong.
Which one?
You know, Tombstone. I'm not a big fan of that one.
Really?
Yeah. Am I wrong in saying that? Have I upset you, Tim? Sorry.
You've upset Tim.
No, but I just find it a bit too clean and a bit too. It wouldn't be like that, then, would it? It'd be dirty, filthy animals, wouldn't they?
Or you're probably you're not lying about that. I mean, I love the place. Tombstone is like.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to go to the place.
One of my top
still got
5
that character, that
places.
Western character.
I mean, as corny as it is, you know, it's very tourist trappy. But you can avoid it, like, if you want to. You don't want to go into a gift shop. You don't want to take part in a ghost tour. Don't do it. And to be honest, like, the entire place is worth it to go in the Birdcage Saloon, you know, the theater.
Yeah.
Or Birdcage Theater. You know, because you really are looking at bullet holes that, you know, from the Cowboys doing this into the ceiling. And
really,
in the
seriously.
And in the basement, they have, you know, a setup of a card game, you know, and in that very same room, they ran a card game. There's a book written about it. A single continuous game of poker that lasted 30-something years. You know, the players would change out, but the exact same game continued.
Oh, my God.
And they they distribute it there. And then there's just so much myth and legend,
Yeah.
They ties into Tombstone and Wyatt Earp, the movie, with Kevin Costner came out at the exact same time.
Yeah, no, I've
Sure,
not
she's
seen
a
that
nice
one. Is
lady
that
and
any
stuff,
good?
but not one movie mentions that Josephine Marcus, who later became Josephine Earp, Wyatt's second common law wife. He was married in a church once, and then he had 2 common law marriages. But Josephine Marcus, is depicted in both as an actress, which she was. She did do some acting. But her primary job in Tombstone was she had a license as a, prostitute. And what they don't tell you is while Wyatt Earp had a house in town, he also had a wagon that you pull up to the back side of the Birdcage Theater, and he'd stay in the wagon, waiting for Josie Marcus, who also had a room right opposite where this card table was, where she plied her trade.
Yeah.
So that is a hidden aspect of Western history that just really isn't discussed. I mean, it's definitely, which is kind of funny because it very much enhances the wild aspect of the
of course.
the Wild
The
West.
thing is, Hollywood got hold of it in the we'll say late 50s, early 60s, didn't they? And they sort of changed it into what it is, what we perceive it to be, or what we perceive it was like.
Well,
And
no
that,
one
would you say that?
no one had even heard of the gunfight at the OK Corral. It wasn't like this thing happened in 1882 and then by 1885 it's famous. No one had heard about it until the early 1920s when Wyatt Earp's like hawking his story, and they started, actors, Tom Nix, etc., started getting their hands on it. And only in the 20th century did the gunfight at the OK Corral become this big thing. I mean, they were probably more likely to call it the shootout on Fremont Street or something like that. The OK Corral is actually a street over from where it was. It was a vacant lot behind the OK Corral, to be specific. But you're not going to say gunfight at the vacant lot behind the OK Corral.
Not, no.
So,
so like the reason I was bringing that Hollywood connection up is because Nate mentioned his granddad and watching one of those Wild West shows, and that really is what Hollywood got hold of. Is that? I mean, they probably went and watched that and thought this will make a great movie. I mean, they even travelled to the UK, from what I understand. This show went around everywhere, went around the world, Japan, the UK. And again, our perception of the West is because of that. And again, these were the people that were involved in it. We know that, but some of because there was an Indian chief, wasn't there, that was involved in it as well. I think one of the Wild West shows. I'm sure it was. But yeah, it's really interesting period for me. I find it fascinating.
I think you might be thinking of Sitting Bull.
Yeah.
Of the Sioux tribe. He ended up, I know, working with some of those shows, and especially after, the Sioux War, I think of 1876, especially after that, once the Sioux had been defeated, I think he kind of went into, he kind of retired from his position, and that's when he started working with the shows and everything else. But there's another interesting aspect is the whole Indian Wars after post-Civil War.
Definitely. Of course, the most famous being Custer's Last Stand, and in the UK, as far as I'm aware, there's even a society dedicated. I don't know about the US, but I know there's a society a little bit like the Round Table that are dedicated just to that particular event.
Yeah,
or to Custer.
Yeah, even here, Tim, I think you know the name of it, but there's something like that here where there's a group of people that go and meet near Custer's Last Stand, and that's its own separate historical group. And it's a huge interest. The Battle of Little Bighorn.
It is. I find it fairly interesting. there's been a lot of stuff made about it as well, and a lot of stuff written about it. And there's all different accounts of this, that, and the other of what actually happens, isn't there? There's so many different. I mean, I even see this program on one of the history channels once. It was absolutely ridiculous that one of the guys actually rid away, and then like do you know? I don't know if you saw. I don't know what it was called, but
Yeah.
he managed to get away from the battle, and he came up with this story, and of what happened and this, that, and it was just terrible. But I don't think there was any survivors as far as I'm aware. But of course, but it is a fascinating little period of history.
Yeah, well, and that's something that the first time I heard of Custer, right, it's associated with Little Bighorn, but what people forget though is
Yes,
that
he was heavily
he actually
involved.
was super popular during the Civil War, and he actually
Yeah,
did very,
big
very
time,
well
big
in the
time.
Civil War. He was and even during the Indian Wars, there was like some hesitancy to even give him command because he was an outspoken Democrat, and President Grant at the time, he was not, a fan of that. But Sheridan, of course, encouraged Grant to give him command and everything else. But there was a number of wars, even besides that with the Sioux, that took place, whether that's in the Pacific Northwest or in the Southwest. There's so many in it. I don't even know how long they all lasted, but long time, very long time.
And I'm glad you brought up those wars, because obviously part of that reason is they were trying to lay the transcontinental railroad. And I find I actually quite find some of the industrial history interesting. I mean, there was this great documentary called The Seven Wonders of the Industrial World, and it featured the sewers under London. It featured, but one of them was a transcontinental railroad, and of course, getting through the Rocky Mountains was tough. A lot of Chinese migrants were involved in that, but you had these towns spring up, and then of course, they had to try and protect the people, didn't they? So that was the excuse for sending out troops to protect the communities that went along with this railroad and everything else that went with it. The other one is the Hoover Dam. That was on their list as well. And that, again, even for that time period, that amount of concrete is just unreal, But I find that quite interesting, that sort of history as well. But I don't know whether you've got anything else to say about that sort of thing, any of you guys.
In between that period, that's when you also have, kind of the Rockefellers. You have all these becoming new billionaires, and
this is when America really becomes, what we know in the 20th century.
And that's what we were talking about, earlier with, when the United States really starts booming. I mean, that's why there's this hesitancy to get involved in Europe and other places, especially during World War One. It's like that's their war. Like, let them deal with that. I think there probably was an argument there. Obviously, what the problem was though is that Germans kept interfering, and they were still destroying American ships, and then there's the Zimmerman telegram, which, thanks to you British for letting us know, that's kind of what got us into the war.
They relished that one.
Oh, I know. Well, hey, Winston Churchill was so happy when the United States got involved in World War II.
Oh, we needed. We were on the ropes. The English Channel saved us, really. From Dover to Calais, it's only 21, 22 miles. Obviously, landing in Dover is near impossible. But if they really wanted to, they could have invaded us. Well, they could have put the full force of the German army, but of course Russia steps in. That's what I was going to get onto, because that's another fascinating period I love, is the Eastern Front in World War II. And I find the fact that you get these two huge dictators bashing heads because they both got the same idea, But
well, and there's actually, there's a whole group of people that are interested in the Battle of Stalingrad out there.
That is just an absolute.
You could talk about Stalingrad for I don't know how long, but
we can definitely do a podcast about that
big battle. It's Stalingrad, and I do know I believe there's actually a historian actually at the Citadel who He wrote a real like all about the Battle of Stalingrad, and he's kind of like the guy on Russian military history and the Battle of Stalingrad. And supposedly this like series of works he did is like considered the definitive study of Stalingrad. I'll need to look up the name of it, but yeah, there's so much you could talk about there. I mean, I
Oh,
think of
100%. I mean, we could be here all day. I mean, actually, a good film has just popped into my head, and it's got a couple of great British actors in it. It's called Enemy at the Gates.
yep, yep.
What a great! It's about a sharpshooter in the Russian army, and it's Jude Law, I believe, and I think Bob Hoskins is in it as well, which is a famous British actor. But
He
I
plays
love that.
Khrushchev.
I love that movie. That was a real good movie, and I'm pretty sure at the beginning it starts where they've only got one rifle between like six of them or something as they run into the. I think it's Stalingrad.
Which
Yeah, it's
my
when
understanding of that is I think that's a myth. I don't know how
yeah,
accurate
okay,
that
fair
is,
enough. Yeah, that's
but
Hollywood
but
for you.
I'm not an
No,
expert on it.
yeah,
I've heard that's a myth. I don't know. I don't know.
yeah, but that
So
is fantastic. That movie.
it is a
Yeah,
good movie. It's a very good
going
movie.
going back to the West, there were some really good Western movies. Sort of like there was a three or four came out in sort of like the noughties. So you had a remake of True Grit, which I really enjoyed. There was one called Appaloosa, which I really liked. That I don't know if you've ever seen that. And there was also called one called Sheridan Falls, which is actually where a Union something he's done something during the Civil War, and he's chasing him through the wilderness, to try and kill him. It's actually got Pierce Brosnan as one of the actors in that, and you've got can't remember the other guy's name, but it's such a fantastic movie. It really is. Go and watch it. But yeah, but yeah, I mean, we could talk all day long about but also before we wrap up here, my love of history even goes into the music period, and I always say to my people I was born in the wrong era because I'm a huge Buddy Holly fan. So the 1950s, that is the age of rock and roll, and I like Elvis as well, don't get me wrong, but I was more of a Buddy Holly fan. That was because I met somebody that's 25 years my age, and his wife likes Buddy Holly as well, So we sort of, but I love that sort of music, rock and roll. So even
Mhm.
music history, that rolls into the Beatles and then everything else that comes after it. But I don't know, have you guys got sort of like that? Do you like that sort of music, or do you like, like historic stuff like that, older music, or?
Yeah, I like Elvis, so I read a little bit there. I liked a lot about the British invasion, Beatles and
Yeah.
stuff.
And
As
again,
far
we
as
know
music
why, 'cause the
goes,
day the music died.
yeah.
So the reason the Beatles became so big, as far as I'm aware, is obviously Elvis was in the army. Jerry Lee Lewis had been a very naughty boy and was married his
Mhm.
cousin who was 14 or something
Mhm.
like that. Um, Obviously, like I said, Eddie Cochran died in a car crash in England, and Buddy Holly had died in 1959, along with the
Yeah.
Big Bopper and Richie Valens. And Richie Valens was like was going to be as big as Elvis. I think he was a very good-looking chap. La Bamba, great movie. Um, yeah,
Well, most of them, unlike Elvis, they actually produced their own music.
they did.
I
Yeah,
did not know this until much later that Elvis never did anything that wasn't a cover.
he was your first ever manufactured pop star. Let's put it that way. And he
So,
had the looks, he had the hips, and that was the end of that.
I mean, yeah, he could play the instruments, but it's true. Elvis could not read or write
No.
music. So, but when it comes to like music, I've always, another hidden thing, I've always been interested in this. I did get from my grandfather. But he gave, apparently any interest I have in medieval stuff must be genetic because he was a closet medievalist.
Hmm.
He also, like Nate's dad grandfather was a doctor. He was a professor of modern languages, French and Spanish, and he wrote his dissertation on the Crusades. But he was also a big classical music guy, so I've always been a fan of classical music. So I love reading about, Beethoven, Mozart, Tchaikovsky, Bach, etc. I like reading about that on the side.
Awesome. What about you, Nate? Have you got any secret
I
music habits?
Well, when they start playing Country Roads, Take Me Home,
Oh yeah, you
I
gotta
can't
love that,
fight
haven't
it.
you?
I can't
Yeah.
fight it.
Oh, you don't like it?
Look,
Oh, right, okay.
I listen to about everything, and
Yeah.
when it comes to music, I've never um, I am the consequence of being born in the 90s and listening to a lot of punk rock growing up, whether it's
Oh yeah.
Blink-182 or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
That's like my cup of tea right there. So,
Oh, nice.
but I love,
There's a lot of history behind music, and it's fascinating, especially in
it
that early
is.
period.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah. Before we wrap up here, anything you guys want to add before we finish up here? Because again, we could talk all day and night, but then people would probably fall asleep. So you know, I've really enjoyed this conversation, just being how to just do this and do something different for a change, I suppose. And even though we did mention the Civil War about 10 times and
It
the
happened.
UK history.
I mean, you can't. Not if I'm on here, you
Yeah,
can't.
exactly. Yeah. You,
No, I just really appreciate you bringing us on, Darren.
yeah, no problem.
Yeah, appreciate it. It was fun.
And all I'm going to say, everybody, is there's lots of stuff we're working on in the background. And going back to the American Civil War again, we have something very, very exciting coming up in the new year. We're going to do and this is the first time anybody's going to hear about this, and we'll advertise it. We're doing Figures of the Civil War, and it'll be its own podcast. And we are going to start with the main man himself, Ulysses S. Grant, and we say we're going to do 3 episodes, but I mean, you could do 20 episodes on the Civil War alone. So it's going to be a difficult one to edit down to what we want to get across. But we're going to cover his early life, his Civil War life, and of course afterwards, which is interesting. Becomes president 2 times, goes and tours Europe, and then writes amazing memoirs. So we're going to, and then of course after that, we will start delving into other interesting people from the American Civil War period, and not just generals, everybody. So it's not going to exclude anybody. So it could be anybody. As far as this platform's concerned, me and Tim do have something in the pipeline to do with World War II. That will be Pearl Harbor. So we'll be doing that in the near future if Tim wants to do that, obviously. You are with that, Tim? Yeah, yeah, he's smiling. But yeah, excellent. So all that's left to say is thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you all very, very soon. Yeah, cheers. Thank you for tuning in to this latest episode of For the Passion of History podcast, which was brought to you by American Civil War and UK History. For blog posts, updates, and links to all of our content, please visit our website. A link to the website can be found via the show's description. Cheers.